How strong are Latin America's military forces as they face U.S. threats? Trump has threatened Colombia, Cuba, and Mexico with military action. Could their armies take on the U.S.? Over the weekend, the United States carried out a large-scale military strike against Venezuela and abducted President Nicolas Maduro in a major escalation that sent shockwaves across Latin America. On Monday morning, U.S. President Donald Trump doubled down, threatening action against the governments of Colombia, Cuba, and Mexico unless they get their act together, claiming he is countering drug trafficking and securing U.S. interests in the Western Hemisphere. The remarks revived deep tensions over U.S. interference in Latin America. Many of the governments targeted by Trump have little appetite for Washington's involvement, but their armed forces lack the capacity to keep the U.S. at arm's length. Latin America's military capabilities. The U.S. has the strongest military in the world and spends more on its military than the total budgets of the next 10 largest military spenders combined. In 2025, the U.S. defense budget was $895 billion, roughly 3.1% of its gross domestic product. According to the 2025 Global Firepower Rankings, Brazil has the most powerful military in Latin America and is ranked 11th globally. Mexico ranks 32nd globally, Colombia 46th, Venezuela 50th, and Cuba 67th. All of these countries are significantly below the U.S. military in all metrics, including the number of active personnel, military aircraft, combat tanks, naval assets, and their military budgets. In a standard war involving tanks, planes, and naval power, the U.S. maintains overwhelming superiority. The only notable metric that these countries have over the U.S. is their paramilitary forces, which operate alongside the regular armed forces, often using asymmetrical warfare and unconventional tactics against conventional military strategies. Paramilitaries across Latin America. Several Latin American countries have long histories of paramilitary and irregular armed groups that have often played a role in the internal security of these countries. These groups are typically armed, organized, and politically influential but operate outside the regular military chain of command. Cuba has the world's third largest paramilitary force, made up of more than 1.14 million members, as reported by Global Firepower. These groups include state-controlled militias and neighborhood defense committees. The largest of these, the Territorial Troops Militia, serves as a civilian reserve aimed at assisting the regular army against external threats or during internal crises. In Venezuela, members of pro-government armed civilian groups known as colectivos have been accused of enforcing political control and intimidating opponents. Although not formally part of the armed forces, they are widely seen as operating with state tolerance or support, particularly during periods of unrest under Maduro. In Colombia, right-wing paramilitary groups emerged in the 1980s to fight left-wing rebels. Although officially demobilized in the mid-2000s, many later re-emerged as criminal or neo-paramilitary organizations, remaining active in rural areas. The earliest groups were organized with the involvement of the Colombian military following guidance from U.S. counterinsurgency advisors during the Cold War. In Mexico, heavily armed drug cartels function as de facto paramilitary forces. Groups such as the Zetas, originally formed by former soldiers, possess military-grade weapons and exercise territorial control, often outgunning local police and challenging the state's authority. The Mexican military has increasingly been deployed in law enforcement roles in response. History of U.S. interference in Latin America. Over the past 2 centuries, the U.S. has repeatedly interfered in Latin America. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the so-called Banana Wars saw U.S. forces deployed across Central America to protect corporate interests. In 1934, President Franklin D. Roosevelt introduced the Good Neighbor policy, pledging non-intervention. Yet during the Cold War, the U.S. financed operations to overthrow elected governments, often coordinated by the CIA, founded in 1947. Panama is the only Latin American country the U.S. has formally invaded, which occurred in 1989 under President George H.W. Bush. Operation Just Cause ostensibly was aimed at removing President Manuel Noriega, who was later convicted of drug trafficking and other offenses.